Hello and welcome to Read All About It, the podcast where people talk about their favourite and not so favourite books. Join me, Paul Cuddihy, as I take each guest on the literary journey of their life, from their most cherished childhood read and a book they'd recommend to anyone, to the book they couldn't be paid to read again, and much more in between. So listen, enjoy, subscribe and spread the word about the Read All About It podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Read All About It podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by Rodge Glass, who is a novelist, a biographer and an academic. He has published 3 novels, a collection of short stories and a graphic novel, as well as a highly acclaimed and award-winning biography of the great Scottish writer Alasdair Gray. Rodge's first novel, No Fireworks, was published in 2005 and was followed 3 years later by Hope for Newborns. His third novel, published in 2012, is the brilliantly titled Bring Me the Head of Ryan Giggs. His graphic novel, Doogie's War, was nominated for Best Graphic Novel at the Scottish Indie Comic Book Awards, while he has also published a short story collection, Love, Sex, Travel, Music, in 2013. Back in 2009, he won the Somerset Maugham Award for Alasdair Gray, a secretary's biography, and he remains a fan of and an expert on Gray, as well as having become a friend of his up to his death last December. Describing himself as a bit of a Strathclyde University addict, Dr. Rodge Glass, to give him his academic title, is returning to the university for his 4th time, having previously been a student, a writer in residence, and also a part-time lecturer. His new role will be as a senior lecturer in creative writing, with his main specialism in fiction and also creative non-fiction. Rodge, or Dr. Glass, I don't know what title you prefer, welcome to the podcast.
That's okay. My grandma Betty always wanted a doctor in the family, but she was really clear that she wanted a proper doctor, and by proper doctor she meant, if I fall down, can you get me up again? I tend only to use the doctor with the bank manager or with somebody that, I'm really not happy with, but also I'm fairly sure won't ask me what kind of doctor I am. Not that I don't think it's legitimate, I do, but I prefer the informal, so please call me.
Yeah, but obviously, exactly, if you're out in a restaurant and something happens and somebody shouts, is there a doctor in your house, you're not going to put your hand up.
A doctor of literature!
You'll write a short story about the incident. In terms of, obviously, I've just read through just a brief biography of you, a potted history of your writing career, your academic career, and obviously academia plays a big role in your life now. Was that something that you've kind of just gravitated towards? Because obviously you start off as a student of creative writing and publish some really highly acclaimed work.
I had always assumed from when I was really young that university was something that I should do. My mum was a departmental secretary at UMIST in Manchester, and when we were on holiday from school, me and my little brother used to go in and do either our homework or our colouring or our drawing or whatever in her office. And it always struck me that she was in a position of great power, because she was always having chemistry professors come into the room and go, "Pam, I've got no idea what I'm doing, help." And so I've always had a great respect for people in that sort of role. It was only really later that I realised that in my immediate family, I was the first one to go to university, and neither of my parents went on to A-levels or had the opportunity to go to university. But the community that I grew up in, which is a pretty orthodox Jewish community in the south of Manchester, it was very, very much geared towards university right from the beginning. I went to a Jewish primary school where we used to do mock exams for the posh private schools in our classes when we were sort of 8, 9, 10 to prepare everybody for it. It was like this is what everybody was supposed to be doing. And it was only really that I appreciated the kind of background that I was from and the expectations that had set for me later on. I was, as many Jewish children are, encouraged to go into professions that many immigrant Jewish families that had come in 3 or 4 generations before, like mine, many of them had been tailors or had little businesses, small independent businesses. And my family was similar. But by the time the 3rd or 4th generation, the feeling was very much like that the children should go on and get something that was a salaried position, something that was secure, something that would assimilate into the community. So I tried to do law at my levels and was horribly bad at it, and I hadn't done English. In fact, when I came to Strathclyde, I wasn't doing English at all, never mind creative writing. I was here to do politics and European studies. And because of the system in Scotland, which is so different to England, and you start off doing lots of different subjects and you can whittle it down later on. In fact, it doesn't really matter where you start. You can end up in a completely different place. So I took English as an elective, and I absolutely fell head over heels in love with contemporary Scottish literature. And it was at that point, really, that I felt excited by university. I was already 3 years into it. And I only then started to think about doing some writing of my own as a possible thing. And I could see that I was in a city that was full of vibrant writers, like ordinary people who weren't dead white men in portrait paintings, and that writing was a thing that you could do. And also that there were writers in that city in particular that really were exciting to me. So university and Glasgow were all mixed up together for me from really early on. And that was a hugely, hugely positive experience. And because I love being part of a community rather than being isolated, and I'm a social animal, I always wanted to be part of universities and academic places where to be a book nerd was accepted and was encouraged. So it's not exactly what my parents might have imagined when they were encouraging / expecting me to go to university right from the beginning, but that's where I've ended up.
I mean, was it revelatory? Because obviously if you said you hadn't really studied English before and then you started writing, had you done any writing yourself? Or was it just something that you kind of take that, I suppose it's a bit of courage where you have to sort of say, can I do this? And then once you do, you find you enjoy it and you maybe find that you're quite good at it, and that's where you end up progressing?
Yeah, I had done some, and in fact, because we're moving house, my mum dropped off a file of my old stuff. Lots of people listening must have had that experience where you're way into adulthood and a parent comes around one day and says, look, this is the stuff I've had in the loft for 20 years and I want rid of it. Here you are. There was all sorts of things from very early school days and reports and little poems that I'd written and small stories and things like that, and even speeches. But I don't think I'd ever done it consistently or felt like I was doing something where I was learning how it worked. I was just doing it on instinct and it wasn't very good, which is fine. That's what you do when you're very young. But I wasn't one of these writers that was constantly writing stories in my notebook from when I was 4 or 5. For me, it was seeing that it was a real possible thing that other people could do. I know you've had Louise Welsh on this podcast. I heard your pod with Louise. I thought it was fantastic. She was one of the first writers in Glasgow that seemed to me to be an ordinary person who had a job, who had then written a book and then published that book, that I would see walking up and down Byres Road. And although we weren't friends and know her, that was some kind of permission to me. Yeah. And I thought, this is a possible thing. Right. I'm quite practically minded. I'm a shameless opportunist. So once I saw it was an opportunity, a thing that could be done, then I thought, right, well, I better get good at this. And I really desperately wanted to do it. Desperately. Bit by bit, opportunities came along.
Because it's interesting, you made a point there about you're a social animal, you like that sense of community and you wanted to be surrounded by writers, because people, and often writers say it's a lonely pursuit because it's just you with your notepad or a laptop and your thoughts and putting them down. But you gravitated towards it because you liked that sense of community that you found in Glasgow. And
yeah, definitely. I mean, Glasgow's I don't need to tell you, Glasgow's a hugely vibrant place. But at that time where I was starting out, there were all sorts of exciting writers that were coming through, and I wanted to read everybody, just interested in the variety of kinds of writing that was coming out. And it didn't feel like there was an overarching type of thing that you had to do. Obviously there were by that point, elder generation of major writers who had changed the landscape, such as Agnes Owens and Alasdair Gray and James Kelman and Liz and Jackie, all of the obvious names. But then there were also writers that were publishing their first books that I felt were doing fantastic work as well. And even in the little editorial group that I had when I was on the Masters, which was at that time joint between Glasgow and Strathclyde, there were about 4 or 5 writers in that group that went on to do really, really good things that I've continued to follow. I think Karen Campbell was in my editorial group, Maureen Myant, who's published a couple of great books, Nick Brooks, who published a few books in the sort of early mid-2000s there as well, around the time that I was getting started. So there was plenty to be excited about. That gave me a sense of community. There were also plenty of live events and there were plenty of nights out. So you get all that solitary time in your room, but it can't be everything. Also, if you don't learn anything about the world or observe anything or share anything with anybody else, then there's a limit to what you can do on your own, I feel. I've always felt like I was at my best when I had a mixture of peace and chaos.
In terms of the podcast, again, just for anybody who's just started listening, it follows the same format where I just ask you various book choices, kind of charts through the story of your literary life, as it were. And the first book I always take you back to is your favourite book from childhood, and the one that you'd chosen was a book called Shakespeare Stories for Children by Leon Garfield and Michael Foreman.
I still got a copy of this somewhere, and I went back and had a look out for it before we spoke. I could have chosen, I'm sure, like nearly everybody that you have on, there's lots and lots of books you love as a child, or else you wouldn't be a reader and a writer as an adult. But I was trying to pick something that said something about the way that I like to approach reading and writing now, or something that showed me a way. I'm a great believer in mentoring and in just how young folk model themselves on what they see as possible. And I've always been interested in the creative response and in adaptation and in different versions of the same thing, responses to stories. And so, although I really struggled with Shakespeare, and I resented Shakespeare by the time I got to him in school, as I know a lot of people who are really interested in reading do, the fact that there were these stories that were turned into a narrative that was accessible to me, that suddenly made those same stories fascinating. And all that had happened is somebody had gone through the Shakespeare plays and then turned them into fairly standard prose and told the story as if it was a series of short stories rather than a series of plays. And there were beautiful illustrations with them as well. But this was something that was an approach that I liked in different contexts. So I also liked translations of Greek myths or adaptations of Greek myths as a kid. And in fact, my best friend as a child, who's now a rabbi, who was very good at telling stories, as rabbis need to be. You've got to be able to give your sermon. And we were driving around in my grandma's rubbishy car in Manchester in the 90s, and I would say, oh, tell me the one about Theseus again, or something like that. We were real nerds. And I always enjoyed versions of the familiar, but made unfamiliar somehow, or changed in some way, or brought back to life. So that's why I've chosen that Shakespeare one. I've still got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the insistence on Shakespeare at schools. I really believe that young people who are interested in the world around them, never mind interested in reading, should have an opportunity to read more in school, things that speak to their experience, or at least a little bit closer to their experience. Like in Scotland, that would mean more books by Scottish writers, or set in Scotland, or set in a world that is recognisable to them. But at school, I barely touched on anything that was published after the Second World War. So that's why I didn't take English at A-level or at university, because I thought, well, that's not something I'm interested in.
Because what I like about your choice is, and again, I've said in a previous podcast, one of the guests, Graham Hunter, for the question, the book he couldn't be paid to read again, he just said Shakespeare. And it goes back to studying at school. I was the same. I didn't enjoy it at all. And it was only when my kids were going through secondary school, and when they were studying it, and we went to see a couple of performances, and it was, for me, it was transformative, because I actually really enjoyed seeing the play performed as it should have been, rather than sitting reading it. And I think something like that for kids, as you say, just putting it into language they would understand and telling the story, because you can always go back later on, and once you know the story, you maybe appreciate the text more.
Yeah, of course.
Because apparently they also adapted them into, I think they made them into TV adaptations.
And it's just better that way. Also, I think I would always rather watch a Shakespeare play that was somehow made relevant or changed or subverted or taken some element in the original and responded to that element in a way that makes it feel fresh. What I always resented was just the kind of bold insistence that this was proper literature and you had to appreciate it and this is how it had to be studied, and that there were predetermined answers to give about what symbolized what, and that you were supposed to reproduce those. I mean, for me, that was the opposite of literature, and that's why I thought I wasn't interested in it, which, thinking back, seems kind of crazy now. But there must be millions of kids out there who would really appreciate and enjoy a version of Shakespeare as an adult, but have been switched off to all sorts of other literature, or anything that speaks to their own experience, their own community, their own times. If you think about kids growing up in Scottish schools at the moment, just the sheer vibrancy of what is out there at the moment that could really speak to what it's like to grow up in Scotland right now. And the same, of course, counts for every nation in the world. Yeah. But if we're all battering our children with Shakespeare, I think we're losing a lot, and that doesn't do Shakespeare any favours. But anyway, I enjoyed those little versions.
Because it's funny, partly touching on, you had mentioned that one of the things you enjoy doing is mentoring, and I guess that's one of the key things of the kind of role you're in now. But sometimes that's just one bit of advice, whether it's as a reader or as a writer. And when I was just doing some research on Garfield, and apparently his first book that he wrote, it was a kind of some pirate novel called Jack Holborn, but he wrote it for adults and he submitted it to the publishers, and one of the editors read it and thought it was okay as an adult novel, but said, why don't you try this? It's got a real potential as a children's novel, which he was persuaded to write it for younger readers. It took off, and that's where he veered towards writing stories for younger readers, and was a great success. And you wonder if that one person hadn't seen that, even things like the Shakespeare stories might have been lost to the world.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I didn't know that. What you're describing is advice, but it's also opportunity. And what I tell my students often is to keep your eyes open for opportunities that might not have been, your original set idea of what you thought you wanted to be. That's not how life works anyway. And you can't say, right, I'm definitely going to take that path regardless of what happens. You have to respond to what happens to you along the way, right? But particularly for writers growing up now, who are often sort of patching up CVs, doing a bit of this and a bit of that and getting experience in different areas as they get themselves established. Aside from the fact that there are all sorts of benefits to doing that, ideas might come along or opportunities might come along that you might never have expected. And by doing those things, you then learn a great deal. So I didn't set out in South of Manchester to write biographies, and I never thought that I would write a biography, but that utterly transformed my writing life. It transformed the way I saw the world around me. It transformed everything that was possible for me after that. And that was because I saw an opportunity and because somebody encouraged me. And without those things, they would never have occurred to me.
Obviously, the biography you're talking about is a biography of Alasdair Gray, which takes us, I like a seamless link in this podcast, and it takes us.
Oh yeah, I'm helping you out. I knew that was coming. I wrote the list myself.
Your favourite book from kind of teenage student formative years, and it is a book by Alasdair Gray, and the one that you've gone for is Poor Things.
Poor Things is always the Alasdair Gray book that I recommend to people first that haven't heard of Gray. I've spent about half of my life overall in Scotland, but anytime I'm out of Scotland, whether I'm travelling or doing book events or just chatting to non-booky folk who'll say, oh, didn't you do that thing about that fella? Who is he again? People that might not necessarily be steeped in Gray folklore or know the visual art or know his place in Scottish literature. If they're just saying, oh, well, what should I read by him? Is he good? Oh, he's good, right, what should I read? Poor Things is always the one I go for because I feel it's got immediacy and it's accessible, but it also has many of the elements that are Gray's strongest suits. So playfulness with form and design, just vivacity. It's a response to a number of Victorian stories that are recognisable. It's kind of a Glasgow Frankenstein. And it's also got the nods to so many other Victorian novels. It's pacey, it's funny, and it's got a wonderful heroine. It's stories inside stories inside stories, but anybody could read it, and it's great fun. Whereas, although my love for Lanark is huge, I wouldn't recommend Lanark as a way in to anybody. I mean, if you love Poor Things, and if you've read several others, and you know a little bit, then I would recommend it, because I just feel it needs a different kind of attention and patience, and it's, it's hard going. That's okay to say. It should be hard going. But I always think Poor Things is a great way in. And I was bought a hardback edition for my 21st birthday. And I didn't actually study Poor Things as an undergrad. I studied Lanark in a module called Modern Scottish Literature at Strathclyde. That is where I first discovered many of the great 20th century Glaswegian writers. There was something about Gray's simplicity with language and clarity, but playfulness, that hugely appealed to me. But it wasn't just that. It was about the doubt in the work, I felt. Although it was political work, it wasn't dogmatic. It felt like it was humble and accepted multiple, possibly conflicting versions of the world. It's difficult to describe, but I felt like there was something in it that really appealed to me, because I'm interested in writing about doubt, and I'm interested in doubt as a concept anyway. And so it was Gray that I really latched onto, rather than, say, Kelman or anybody, Leonard or anyone else. And I then just read everything and absolutely fell head over heels for it.
Because it's funny when you touched earlier on the fact that maybe contemporary Scottish kids should maybe be learning more about Scottish literature and reading more. And I came through Scottish education at a time where we didn't. And I first came to Alasdair Gray. I ended up going and doing some night classes up at Glasgow University just on 20th century Scottish literature. It was just a way to kind of keep my brain ticking over. So you would get a book, we would read it, and then the following week we would discuss it in class. And it was great just to get back into that way of reading a book but trying to analyse it and then getting other people's thoughts. We did Lanark over 2 classes because of just the complexity of it, but it really helped me, because I think just reading it, as you touched on, just reading it myself, I think I might have toiled a bit, but just being able to go in and have somebody speak about it, and then either you voice what you thought or even your questions, your doubts in it, it made me appreciate the book. I still think, although up here people would know Alistair, I still think he's maybe underappreciated in terms of, the wider Scottish readership. I think Poor Things is just that, as you described there. I think it's a brilliant novel that maybe people don't know as well. People may maybe be able to say, yeah, he was the guy that wrote Lanark. They might not be able to list these other books, but Poor Things, I think, is just a brilliant novel that more people should know about, more people should be reading.
It's right up there. I mean, it's interesting. I think the longer time goes on, the more that Alistair is closely associated with Lanark. You often see him cited as the Lanark author, in articles about him. And although he does definitely have an international reputation, and that book was widely translated. In fact, Poor Things was a big commercial success at the time. It won the Whitbread Prize, which was a big deal. Jonathan Coe was on the judging panel that year. There was even an American tour that he did in the early 90s. It was a book that was commercially successful as well as prize winning, and it did have an impact at the time. I think because Lanark was so transformative, it did something that was broader about the way that Scotland saw itself that Poor Things didn't. Well, none of his other books did in the same way. So although there are 30 or 40 other fantastic books and there's an absolute huge treasure trove there, I think it's understandable why Lanark is the one that is continually returned to. And the landscape that some of the characters in Lanark are complaining about was transformed simply by the publication of Lanark. That in itself is something extraordinary, really. It's hard for people coming to Glasgow now or growing up there, I think, that have known nothing else but a landscape with Alistair in it. And by that, I mean physically. So in the mural at Hill Head, in the auditorium at Oran Moor, in the mural at Ubiquitous Chip, it's hard for them to imagine a landscape without him in it, or with a landscape with him at the margins, or indeed a landscape where there wasn't much for Scottish writers coming up, because it's so incredibly vibrant and international now. But it really wasn't that long ago that Edwin Morgan was referring to it as a wasteland. By that he meant there was no publishing opportunity. There wasn't much in the way of the kind of community now that I think that many take for granted. I mean, there are exceptions to that, of course. I'm always wary of generalisation, but it's incredibly transformed, and Lanark was such a big part of that I understand why people keep coming back to it.
I mean, one of the things in my day job, I work at the Celtic View, and it's the magazine for Celtic Football Club. And back in 2001, the first time the club qualified for the Champions League group stages, so we wanted to mark it in a special way. So we actually commissioned Alistair to design a special front cover just for just to commemorate that. And it remained.
Yeah, I know. I'm the ultimate grey nerd. This was part of my homework in the early 2000s.
Well, it remains the biggest selling issue of the magazine, yeah. And it's actually the day we're actually speaking on August the 11th, although the podcast will go out later. And this is actually the 55th anniversary of the Celtic View. So it's been going for 55 years. That issue was the biggest selling issue. We get loads of publicity about it. And I think a lot of people who wouldn't normally buy the magazine, well, might not be interested in football or Celtic, but because Alistair had designed the cover. And it was always one of my proudest moments. I went out for dinner with him and his wife ahead of doing it. And it was just, as somebody who was a fan, it was a great thrill. And obviously, you touched on the fact you're a fan, you became his biographer, his friend as well. And that must have been a great experience for you as well.
Well, that was my ultimate educational experience. It was hugely important for me personally. And I don't think I would be a writer today without it. But there were some really mundane ways in which it helped, as well as inspirational ways. He paid me about 3 times what I was getting in the pub at the time to be his secretary. He said he'd pay a tradesman's wage, and that often meant paying somebody else more than he was being paid himself for whatever it was he was doing. Well, I should say that I only got the gig as Alistair's secretary because Morag, his wife, was absolutely sick of having to do it herself. And he'd had a number of secretaries beforehand, often young writers who were on their way up who needed a little bit of support, or artists on the way up. And he never used a computer himself. He always said, I always assumed a computer was a more complicated version of a typewriter, and I never learned to use one of those. So he needed somebody to help. At the time, I was one of his tutees in the 2 years that he was a professor at the MLit course in Glasgow. In many ways, he was an absolutely terrible tutor. He would rewrite absolutely everything that you did. And there were absolutely huge digressions, and the meetings would often go on for hours and would often be more about him than they were about you. But in amongst that, although I knew that wasn't ultimately hugely helpful to my own writing, I felt like I was getting such a huge education. And at that point, I knew enough about Alistair to know what a privilege it was just to be in his company. I felt like I could learn something from that. And so when he needed a secretary, I asked if I could do it. And then before I knew it, I was sitting at his computer in his bedroom 5 days a week as he was pointing at the screen with a hovering finger and literally making sentences up off the top of his head and going, move that word, shift that word back, delete that one, replace that one, write it again. So there were mundane ways that helped. There were ways in terms of editorial that it showed me how a writer could live. I did his correspondence and set up his first email account and had to explain what junk mail was to him. That was a good laugh. You know, although I didn't have any particularly great secretarial skills, I couldn't type fast, but you didn't need to. It was just an opportunity to see him at work. And that was absolutely incredible. That was, and will always be, the biggest impact on my writerly life. And because he was so many years older than me as well, and he was in his later years of what he'd already achieved everything he wanted to achieve and then was still going. I think he was at peace with what he'd already made and just kept creating things that he enjoyed. And so there was something worthwhile in seeing that at work as well, rather than seeing writing as a kind of an obligation or something that was to be complained about or was hard work. I never felt like that's what I was seeing. So that was definitely the biggest influence on me. In seeing that, I then saw an opportunity. I thought, people in Scotland in 100 years are going to want to know what it was like to be in a room with Alasdair Gray, and here I am. And nobody's done this yet. And Alistair always used to say, even if fame, even if the desire for fame and money drives somebody to make something that is not yet made, that is legitimate. I mean, he always said it with his tongue in cheek, but he meant it as well, I think. And there was something that didn't exist, which was nobody had, although there were millions of pieces about Alasdair Gray and lots of interview profiles and lots of articles and academic stuff, and there have been academic books, nobody had attempted the life yet. And I thought, well, I can do that, but I can do it if I can also do a series of portraits about him, because I just felt like I'd sat with him for so many hours that I could do the voice. And I thought, if I could do the voice on the page, then the project is worthwhile. Because anybody can sit with a pile of the books or look at the visual art and critique it. And I don't think I did that better than anybody else. Or anybody can do a walk through the life or find out where he grew up or where he went during the war. But maybe not everybody could do the voice and the scenes, which are portraits, talking to him about his mother, having a whiskey with him, driving him to a friend's funeral, watching him paint, all those sorts of things that became scenes in the biography.
You're listening to the Read All About It podcast with me, Paul Cuddihy, and my guest, Rodge Glass. And Rodge, we're on to your third book choice in this podcast, and that's a book you'd recommend to anyone. And the book you've chosen is Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine.
Oh, this book is like a punch in the face. It's brilliant and particularly relevant at the moment, I think. So I first read this book in around 2014, 2015, when the Black Lives Matter movement was really breaking out in America. For folks that don't know, this is a sort of hybrid book that is part prose poetry and part art and part film. It was rarely for poetry. It was a New York Times #1 bestseller. This isn't an obscure book. It had a huge cultural impact at the time. I think that there were subsequent versions of the book that were changed as time went on. What was added were new incidents. So what incidents were covered in this book? Well, they were ordinary, everyday racist incidents in the United States. And some of them were huge. Some of them were very, very small. Some of them were personal. Some of them were things seen through the TV. So there's a famous sequence about the treatment of Serena Williams in a particular match. But many of the pieces came out of interviews that Rankine did with other people that she knew. And she just asked folks that she knew for moments where they felt that they were, and the way that she puts it is, reduced to their race. And I love that phrasing because it acknowledges that identity is something, it matters to everybody, but it's not everything that you are. And there's something inherent in that I really identify with very strongly. And these moments are incredibly powerful. It's funny, it's the smallest ones, really, that I remember the most. There are moments where somebody's walking up to somebody else's house and they have a meeting or an appointment. I think it's a physiotherapist appointment. The woman comes to the door and sees a black person at the door and starts to try and shoo them away. Then they realise that, in fact, this is somebody who's there for an appointment and that they were expecting them. And the person at the door is mortified and starts apologising, but of course it's too late. Just these tiny little everyday moments of reduction, and they're juxtaposed in a really interesting way. It's beautifully poetic prose. The individual pieces are in amongst various different works of art from different periods. There are stills from the Serena Williams section. There are references to racist killings of the time, and the subsequent editions of the book added new prose poems to respond to recent racist killings. I don't need to explain to you why that's particularly relevant now in 2020, but it's a book I recommend to anyone, and that's exactly why. It's really extraordinary work.
I mean, it's kind of sad and depressing in a way that, as you say, with each edition of the book, that there is this addition of catalogue of things that have happened. It's, the book was published 6 years ago, and even just off the top of your head, you can think of, even like in relation to Serena Williams, the way that maybe the British media treat Raheem Sterling, for example.
Oh yeah.
Is a perfect example of, they won't say why they treat him differently, but everybody knows that he's articulate and courageous enough to stand up and call it out. And again, there's just other instances of things happening in the UK and in America, but it's kind of sad that there's a constant need for the book to be updated, because
That's
things
true.
are getting better,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when George Floyd was killed, she wrote a new poem called Weather, which was published in, I want to get this right, I think it was the New York Review of Books or the New York Times. It was on the front of it. It's a direct response to that particular murder. So she's still doing these responses. She has a new book out just this month called Just Us, which is American Conversation, and that explores similar territory. But I can't imagine a time where it's not going to be relevant. There's a great line in the poem Weather, which is easy to find online. I recommend it to you all. It says, "Whatever contracts keep us social compel us now to disorder the disorder." I think that's a fantastic line. And there's something that is truly poetic, but doesn't feel dogmatic. And there's enough space inside each of these stories that are in Citizen to allow readers to imagine themselves in these situations, or to feel part of it, even if they're not part of the same community. I think that is critical as well, because if your work is dogmatic, or it's too obviously just trying to persuade somebody of something, then it's not really art. And you have to be able to have those subtleties, those potentialities that the writer can't always imagine. I think those need to be there for readers, or else most readers just switch off. If you feel like you're just being told what to think, you're less likely to engage. And that's why Rankin has got the balance just perfect, I think.
And also, I think it's important that people don't say it's a problem that's happening elsewhere. And sometimes it can be easier to look and say, "Oh, it's terrible what's happening in the United States." There's examples closer to home that would resonate for, I'm guessing, that anybody who would read this.
Yeah, it's not about America, it's about planet Earth. Yeah. Which is why you saw protests in response to the Floyd killing in so many different countries, because it was recognised.
I always like, in terms of the podcast, that we kind of go from the two extremes of a book that you would recommend to anyone to a book that you couldn't be paid to read again. And this book is, I'm not sure if is it 2666 or 2666 by Roberto Bolaño.
I'm afraid I've cheated here, Paul. Sorry. I don't like being critical of anything, so I was looking for a way to dodge the question. So I absolutely love 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, and I'm a huge fan of Bolaño. Having said that, if I live for 1,000 years, I will never read it again, because it was utterly draining experience, utterly exhausting, totally all-consuming. I lived in Chile for about 4 or 5 months in 2013-14. I was over there at the time they had an election on around the 40th anniversary of the 1973 coup. In a way, I fell for Chilean literature in a way that has only happened to me once before, and that was Scottish literature. And there are all sorts of writers from that country and that community, a series of communities. It's such a big country that I'm now busy recommending to people all the time. Alejandro Zambra is one of my favourites. And Zambra and Bolaño are also experts in doubt. But Bolaño wrote furiously, started out as a poet and always perceived himself as a poet. He was exiled from Chile. He went to Mexico for a while first as a teenager and a young man, and then came to Spain. He was completely unknown in Chile and lived in poverty, did all sorts of different jobs, and then moved from poetry to prose in order to support his family, which sounds like a joke. He moved into doing literary fiction in order to support his family. But he wrote about 13 books in the last decade of his life, one of which was The Savage Detectives, which was hugely rare in that it was a Spanish language novel that was a massive success in the United States, and that instantly made his reputation. And he was writing 2666 as he was dying. He was waiting for a liver transplant. He was on the list and they never got to him. He died at 50 years old. A detail I like is that he told his children, "Look, this book is in 5 parts. Publish it in 5 parts and you'll make more money." He died and they read it and they went, "Well, this is obviously a novel that's supposed to go together," and they published it as one. That made an even bigger splash than The Savage Detectives did. It's set all over the world. It moves forwards and backwards over about 100 years. It has a part which is essentially just documenting of hundreds of killings of forgotten women in Mexico based on the real killings in Santa Teresa in the 1990s. And it's done in such a way that it doesn't glamorize one tiny little bit. It's so uncomfortable to read and in a sense so depressing, because Bolaño is forcing you to look at how many people are forgotten and how they are forgotten and how little changes. Bolaño specialised in the detective story with no solution. So he always was writing crime stories where nobody solves the crime at the end. And in short literary novels, these are often work incredibly well. In 266, it was absolutely maddening because you follow this damn thing for 1,000 pages and nobody finds out who the killer is at the end. Anyway, it's the most wonderful novel and it reminds me of my time in Chile, but I will never, ever go back to it.
That's an interesting way to interpret it, the question. But one thing I was fascinated about was, you mentioned the fact he was writing it as he was dying. Apparently, the manuscript that ended up being published, that was the only copy of it. It wasn't like he'd been through various edits, so it was obviously published posthumously as he'd written it.
That's incredible, yeah. And he wrote very, very fast. You can see that in the way that it reads line to line. This is not incredibly succinct, understated, edited with a scalpel, minimalist stuff. It is the pouring out of Bolaño's brain, and it is wandering, and it shifts this way and that, and it feels like something that has been written on one manuscript. It really does, and that's part of the appeal of it. Some people find it maddening, but I loved it for that. And you might get 2 or 3 pages where a character is thinking about something and then they're thinking about 5 things it might mean, and then it moves on to something completely unrelated. It goes through periods of high drama. There's a bit about boxers in Mexico, and then there's an incredibly dry bit about academics that all seem to be having sex with each other most of the time. It's constantly shifting, the way that Bolaño's mind was constantly shifting. I think if you were to do it in a conventional laptop way, then the book would never have been created. Yeah. I'm always interested in the relationship between the way that things are written and the context they're written in and how they read on the page.
And if he'd lived, he may well have published them at 5 different parts and made more money of it.
Perhaps he would have done, or maybe he'd have changed his mind. Who knows? I mean, he's one of these writers that, a little bit like some of my favourite musicians whose archives have been scraped out after their death. Everything that he'd ever put to paper has been published since. You've got to be careful now when you recommend Bolaño to somebody, because they might pick some half-finished thing that was at the bottom of the drawer that was published 9 years after he died that nobody read and is rubbish. Because there's everything out there now, but there is a huge body of incredible work that's been presented in all these different ways that Bolaño never intended. There was another collection of short stories, The Insufferable Gaucho, that it's got an essay in it, it's got a speech in it, and there's stories that he didn't really like. Then the very best collection that he ever wrote was one that was sort of selected stories for the English language that he never wanted to exist. It's called Last Evenings on Earth. And in the late 90s, around the time that publishers in the UK were just starting to take a chance on Bolaño, like a really small chance, they published this book as a tester to see whether they could find any readers for him. And they picked stories of his from Spanish that they thought would go down well in the UK. And then that led to the best collection there is of his work, in my opinion. So the author doesn't always know best.
You mentioned there the fact you'd stayed in Chile for a while, and obviously you then fall in love with Chilean literature. And I was reading an interview with yourself on Strathclyde University's website where you'd mentioned that you've written another novel called Once a Great Leader, which I think they describe as an alternative history of relations between Chile and the UK.
Yes, and specifically Scotland. I've been writing it for about 6 or 7 years and it's not finished, and I might yet write it for another 10 years. We'll just have to wait and see. It's one of these that is all-consuming, and at one stage it was about 300,000 words. Now it's down to about 100. I don't know what to do with it, but it will get finished and it will be my best book in the end. It covers 50 years from 1970 to 2020. And the vast majority of the book is based on real history. Desaparecidos, people who had disappeared from Chile in the early 70s and exile from Pinochet's regime. And in fact, there were a very small amount of Chileans that came to Scotland in that period. The longer the novel goes on, the more that it becomes imagined, and that I have a Chilean heroine who I imagine becomes a great politician and becomes the Prime Minister of the UK after Theresa May. Remember that coup against Jeremy Corbyn where they tried to bring him down by all resigning at the same time?
Yeah.
And then it didn't work. Okay, so I imagine that she comes up through there and is this incredibly charismatic, unusually great orator who has a glorious success and then an even more glorious failure. And it's my way of playing with history, but exploring that Chilean history and the way that Chilean history speaks to the UK as well. So Thatcher is a character, Pinochet is a character, the narrator is a biographer, of course. I'm continually returning to the same things, but in different ways, as many writers do. So I'm interested in writing lives. I'm interested in doubt and ambiguity and the difficulty of tying down what a life means. All of these issues that in some ways were in the Ryan Giggs novel and were in the Alasdair Gray biography. Whether it will ever be finished, I don't know, but I quite like the idea of having a great lost novel. I published a lot in a short period of time, and that was fine, but I'm kind of becoming fond of the idea that I should have a book that I'm working on forever and ever and ever.
Yeah, I suppose if you just put it out there so everybody knows, and they're just constantly, there's that sense of bubbling anticipation.
Alistair did it with Lanark for 30 years, and then he was an overnight success in his 50s. So that's a decent, it's a half decent model.
So you've only got about another, what's that, 24 years to go before we...
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to need to write a few more million words and then cut them off.
Hopefully at one point it will see the light of day. We are on to the last question in the podcast, and that is the last book you read or are currently reading, and the one you've chosen is Department of Speculation by Jenny Offal. I'm
rereading this at the moment, but I only read it for the first time a few months ago. It was recommended to me by Andrew Meehan. He's a great novelist I worked with at Strathclyde. It was one of these books that I'd heard a lot about, but didn't really even know what it was. I didn't know whether it was a novel or a short story collection or an essay collection. We just had a conversation where he was recommending me a few books. We were supposed to move shortly before lockdown hit, and then we didn't. So all of my books were in my new office at Strathclyde. In fact, my books were the only thing of mine that had moved to my office. I hadn't actually moved the rest of my life yet. So once we hit lockdown, I had literally nothing. And yet I was still teaching at the university and working with books every day, but doing it without a single book in the house. So after this conversation with Andrew, he recommended me a few things. And I started to get books through the door, which the kids found very exciting. You know, when you're not leaving to go anywhere because of lockdown, the post arriving is a major event in a day. So Department of Speculation arrived, and I rattled through it in a day. It is a fragmented but somehow coherent narrative that is the history of a relationship, but it's always also reaching out and using different quotations from other worlds the whole time. It's kind of hard to describe, but it feels like a very personal non-fiction story, but it's sort of framed like a novel. And I still don't really know exactly what it is, but it had a really big impact on me because I'm starting to write a book of essays about doubt. And this seemed to me like a possible approach, a way to talk about your own life, the way that you see the world around you, but also to use the things that writers use all the time, which is literature to hide from the world and engage with the world at the same time. I've not phrased that exactly as I wanted to, but I believe that, speaking for myself, I have often used writing as a way to hide from the world and engage with the world at the same time, and I use reading the same way. And in reading Jenny Offal's book, I felt like either her or the narrator of that book was doing exactly the same thing. And that's something that instantly appealed to me. Also, there's something that's interesting about the copy that I've got with me. So this is the one that arrived in the post, and it was a second-hand copy. On the inside page, there's a thing that says May 2017, and it's underlined. And then it says, "To the eye of you, Lucy, so that you will learn to trust me again and yourself completely with love." From, I think it says John, but I don't know. So this book has been given as a gift to somebody else who was looking for forgiveness. And in amongst the pages, get this, there are bits circled, things in brackets, messages, things that reference points in their relationship, things that are circled saying, "Read this poem," or "This made me think of New York," or all these sorts of things. And at times it's like a kind of bullying of Lucy. It feels like a kind of bullying. And at times it feels excusable and maybe even sweet in places, but mostly it just feels creepy.
I mean, it's almost a story within it's a separate story within the book.
So my experience of reading Department of Speculation is partly about this relationship that is in the book, but it's also about the relationship between John and Lucy. And I kept putting it down, and in between doing the dishes or being out walking with my children, I would think to myself, what did John do? He never says in any of his notes what it is he's looking for forgiveness for. And I wonder why he thinks that somehow the purchase of this book, which obviously means something to him, is going to somehow help Lucy forgive him. But I assume that she didn't because she sold it on Amazon.
Exactly. So I'm hoping that perhaps John or Lucy or somebody who knows them is listening to this. We can get the full story.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's absolute gold. But it does suit the book in an odd way because it's a book that doesn't answer your questions. I'm a great believer that writers, I don't like high horse writers, as I call them, people that feel like the place of the writer is to be above society and to comment upon what it all really means. That doesn't appeal to me at all. and writers that speak as if they know everything, or indeed know anything, that really switches me off. What I love are writers where I can see that they're acknowledging their own vulnerability, their own lack of knowledge, but still trying to engage with the world around them in the best way they know how. And that is a kind of wisdom itself. You see it in Kathleen Jamie's essays on the natural world, for example. And I think you see it in Jenny Offal. I think you see it in Claudia Rankin. You certainly see it in Alasdair Gray. And there's something about the way that Department of Speculation is delivered in this story about a relationship that's falling apart, but you don't quite know why. There's something that in that really works very well, being annotated upon by this guy, John. Or maybe it's a Jan or a Jen or something, but I think it reads John. And it's a kind of conversation between those two relationships. And I don't think I'll ever be able to divorce them from each other. They'll always be part of the same thing for me. It was absolute gold. It's gold.
One of the recent guests on the podcast, Catherine Simpson, and during the course of our discussion, she was talking about how she quite liked getting books that were annotated by previous owners, and she thought that added something to it. Generally, I don't like getting a book where people have written in it. It's always been a
Paul,
thing.
You would hate this. You would absolutely hate it. Poor Lucy can hardly enjoy a single line without John circling it or underlining it. At one point, on page 15, I've got it right here. Okay, I'll just read you a couple of lines. That year I didn't travel alone. I'll meet you there, you said. And John's underlined, I'll meet you there, you said. But it was late when we spotted each other at the train station. You had a $10 haircut. I was fatter than when I'd left. It seemed possible that we travelled across the world in error. And then he underlines the final line. We tried to reserve judgment. And then John adds a smiley face. I mean, there is absolutely no excuse for that sort of behaviour. How can you, oh, I don't even know where to start.
We were talking about, you mentioned obviously the novel that you're working on. You started working on a book of essays as well. And how do you find that balance between obviously your own writing and your work in terms of encouraging others to write? Because I'd imagine that can at times be all consuming as well in terms of mentoring people, lecturing.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of reading in itself.
It is. There's no doubt about that. And certainly if you're a part-time writer, then if you're part-time academic, you've got more time to write. There's no doubt about that. But I get so much out of it. And the job that I've just got is the job that I've been after for about 20 years, basically. And I'm really, really excited about being able to lead the MLet at Strathclyde and being able to mentor writers in the way that I was mentored by others. My first mentor at Strathclyde was Robert Allen Jameson, who's a brilliant and underrated Scottish writer. He was the writer in residence at Strathclyde when I was an undergraduate. He was the first writer to encourage me, the first person to encourage me in my creative work at all. And so if you add somebody like him, my experience with Alistair, and lots of other things that have happened to me, I just feel like mentoring others is the best thing that a writer can do, really. Of course, it means there is less time, and I've worked slower since, but then I've also learned more. I think you're part of something, trying to build something, and although I'm an outsider to Glasgow and to Scotland, and I'll never have the accent, I do really care about Glasgow. I do really care about that institution that I'm working at, and I do really think that there's huge value in supporting young writers. I know that some people are a little bit sniffy about it, but I really believe that this is just the way that communities of writers work in modern day. Thankfully, things are a little bit more egalitarian than they used to be. No longer a case of, somebody's uncle at Bloomsbury, you live around the corner and you've got plenty of money to sit and write. It's a little bit more open than it used to be, and ordinary folk can do it. Alistair used to say that learning to write was a little bit like being a brain surgeon. Obviously, you need to be born with steady hands. Nobody can really teach you that. I don't have steady hands at all. But you can teach people all of the other elements that you desperately need to know in order to be a good brain surgeon. Those things can be taught. So I believe that you can do that on a writing program. That added to encouragement, community, mentoring, those are the kind of things that make us feel less alone. And those things have always really mattered to me hugely. So yeah, you've got the challenge of somehow balancing supporting lots of other people with taking time for yourself as well. And I do certainly work more slowly than I used to. But then I also feel like I'm part of something in the way that I didn't. So I was a freelance writer for quite a while and just did my own writing. And I missed being part of something. I mean, we're not in the office at the moment. Nobody's in the office. Nobody knows when they'll be in the office again. But there's an open plan office at Strathclyde. And I'd been in an office on my own for years. And I realised as soon as I was in it just how much I enjoyed that interaction with other people. And also that in talking to other people who care about writing, who care about books, you learn a lot more that way. Certainly I do. Yeah. And maybe not everybody works the same way, but I feel like gives me ideas and gives me energy as well. So, for example, spending time with Andrew and talking over his favourite stuff, what we're working on, sharing a little bit of work with each other. That's not something I'd necessarily be able to do if I was working in isolation. And so there are a lot of positives to being in the academic environment, even though it's very hard to deny you get less time for your writing. Of course you do, because you've only got a finite amount of time.
And nice as well in terms of your own journey, in terms of writing, starts off at Strathclyde and comes full circle, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. Also in the wider city, you know, I did my PhD at Glasgow University, and when I did the MLit in the olden days, it was actually joint between both institutions. And I feel like a lot of my work has been about Glasgow studies. Obviously, from the outside, I'm an outsider, there's no doubting that. But a lot of my life's work has been about trying to make sense of Glasgow. And a lot of the work I've got on Alasdair Gray coming up over the next few years is going to be Gray studies as Glasgow studies. So there is a kind of circularity to that, but it's not just about Strathclyde, it's about being back in that city that had such a huge impact on me. And I came from a very, very different background to many of the people in that city. I was from a very Orthodox Jewish background. I learned Hebrew and Bible studies at my primary school. We supported Israel like it was a football team, and I didn't learn what Palestine or Palestinians were until I was living in Israel and realised that I didn't really want much to do with it at all, or more, rather that I was very uncomfortable with it. And I moved from there to Glasgow as a 19-year-old, knowing nothing about the place. But pretty much since that point, Glasgow, the study of Glasgow, the reading about it and learning about it has been my primary interest. And so that does feel like, assuming I can ever actually move there, COVID willing, that will be a satisfying kind of circularity. And then I don't think I ever want to move again. I think then I'll be happy to stay.
Well, it'll be good to have you back in the city.
Thank you very much.
Well, listen, sadly, Rodge, we're out of time for the podcast. It's been great talking to you about some of your favourite books, and I will be looking forward to, in about 24 years' time, reading Once a Great Leader.
Oh, it'll be a great novel in 2040 something. Yeah, look out for it.
Yeah, but listen, thanks very much for joining me on the podcast.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Read All About It podcast, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. You can get in touch via Twitter at ReadAllAbout20, on Instagram at ReadAllAboutItPodcast, or you can send an email to readallaboutit@paulcuddihy.com. If you've enjoyed the podcast, subscribe, leave a review and spread the word. If you haven't enjoyed it, say nothing to anybody. But I do hope you can join me, Paul Cuddihy, next time on the Read All About It podcast. And in the meantime, keep reading.